Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session of dtalks or Disruptive Literacy Talks. I'm your host, Mashood. When we are talking about foundational literacy and numeracy and achieving these foundational skills for all, it's very important to understand where we stand in terms of equity in education. And this is something which many legislations, many policy frameworks in India have talked about, right from the Right to Education Act to RPWD to the National Education Policy. And the question of equity has become even more pertinent now because of the massive digital divide and related consequences in access and equity of education, which we are facing post the pandemic. So, this is going to be an important aspect on moving forward in terms of policy, in terms of community participation, in terms of what the civil society organizations can do. Equity has to be at the very center of any missions or any goals which move towards foundational achieving foundational literacy and numeracy for all. And to discuss on this, on where we stand and what is the way forward with respect to equity and inclusion in primary education, we have a leading expert and a very renowned personality who has worked extensively on the questions of equity and inclusion. She is also leading. She's been a leading member of the RTE Forum as well, and a lead campaigner on inequality at Oxfam India as well. Previously, she's also been the technical director of education at Care India. So it's an absolute honor for us to welcome Ms. Anjela Taneja. Anjela ji, thank you so much for your time and for joining us here today.
My pleasure.
Right. So Anjela ji, to start with, we in our education system has been governed by various legislations, policy frameworks, which have really talked about equity in education, and more so referring to the RTE Act. And of course, that led to these frameworks which within which presently primary education is working on. What is your assessment of how these legislations and frameworks, and coming all the way to the national education policy, how have they looked at equity in education, and how successful have they been in ensuring equity in education?
So it's obviously, as you're pointing out, it has been part of the legal frameworks as well as policy frameworks as well as program frameworks ever since independence. If you go back to even our constitutional provisions, right to equality is enshrined in the constitution, which is critical to remember given we've just crossed a critical milestones of India as a free nation. So therefore, the right to equity in education is not just something that's part of the commitment towards ensuring equitable quality education, but also part of the overall commitment of India to its people in terms of because you cannot have equity for all, you can't have equality for all without having an equitable and equal chance to attain high quality education, because education is a tool towards empowerment and getting access to the other goals as well. So therefore, that has obviously been part of the policy framework. That has obviously been a legal commitment, but the more I grow older, the less optimistic I am about policy frameworks, because fundamentally it's the social fabric and the implementation mechanism that plays a mediating role in ensuring implementation of policies. And therefore, yes, our education system is unequal, but that's probably, at least to a substantial degree, a reflection of the fact that our society is unequal, be it in terms of the fact that life chances are unequal for the rich and the poor, the life chances are unequal for Dalits, Adivasis, and the upper castes, the educational chances of a child born in Kerala are very different for a child who's born in Bihar. And of course, the life chances are different for boys and girls as well. So, accordingly, mechanisms and capacities of this, the willingness of society to ensure equity is has until now unfortunately not been as much as one would have wished for. And a lot of the mechanisms of the state are accordingly also grounded in the belief that fundamentally inequitable education systems are okay. It's okay to have elite highest quality of education for the rich and barely anything for the poor. So therefore we get the education system that we are able to bargain collectively for, and that's a fairly unequal education system.
Right. And we see that like historically, like India has been an very unequal society in a lot of different aspects. But we see the children now bearing the brunt of some of these inequalities, especially because of the pandemic. And while of course digital divide is something which is really talked about a lot, what would your assessment be about how these inequalities are manifesting and affecting children at this point of time, and do you feel that this is something which is going to have long term impact?
So obviously, yes. In terms of how is it unequal, uh, access and ability to get some form of education is unequal right now. Obviously, one the elephant in the room is the digital divide, be it in terms of access to devices, but also access to space to study, access to the opportunity to study. When education schooling is disrupted, there are all these alternatives that come in for the poor in terms of ch- uh, family responsibilities for girls, or child, plain and simple child labor for boys. Those become tempting alternatives when schooling isn't delivered. A digital divide and therefore unequal access to whatever passes for education uh, during online learning and even remote education. Therefore that is a unequal. Just last week we've had an incident in Orissa of a boy who used to climb onto a hilltop to because that was literally the only place in the village which had a connection to a mobile, to the internet, from where he could attend any sort of classes. We're now in the monsoons. The boy slipped, fell, died. So therefore, that's the level to which one is. Families are ready to make the biggest sacrifices to make sure that their kids study, but unfortunately, the systems are not conducive to the at least attaining even the basic minimum level of provision. At the same time, it's also, even if you are able to access online education, it's also becoming more dependent on the capacity of parents to sit and handhold and tutor children. So again, those from slightly better off financially families with better educated families are the ones who are able to at least sustain education, whereas those who come from first generation learner families, etc., can't uh, don't have the capacity to handhold, don't have the capacity to sit and get their kids homework done for them, therefore are more likely to fall behind. And effectively, it's been 1.5 years for the youngest children in India who have not had any education whatsoever, which is extremely unfortunate. And take in the case of at least in a government school, one is able to continue education, what one of whatever form. In the case of private schools, especially some of the low, including some of those so-called low fees ones. uh, if you don't pay, and a lot of families can't pay right now, given their families have lost their jobs, you end up losing access to education completely, because in a privatized education system, it's your a big family's parents' capacity to pay, which from which derives the right to education of those children to study in those schools.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. Another aspect of which has another phenomena, in fact, which we have seen post the pandemic, is about mass migration, which has a lot of distress migration, often from urban to rural areas back as well. And I think education of migrants is something which is always vulnerable, because there's often disruption even pre-pandemic phase as well. What would your thoughts be on how the education of migrant families, children of migrant families, has been impacted? And are there any any specific policy recommendations which have worked or should be kind of adopted in order to address those challenges?
So, two or three things. One is obviously, let me, before I get into recommendations, your first part of your question, what are the challenges? So, one of the obvious case, or in some ways, this is all, a lot of this has always been the case with respect to migrants. The difficulties in getting access to schooling has always been a challenge. There has always been a requirement for documentation, which has been difficult to obtain, at least for government schools. In a lot of cases, at least the RT Act provides you for, at least you a kid cannot be denied education because of absence of documentation. So therefore, at least some of that is, at least those provisions exist on the books. So therefore, that's a but again, it's a never ending cycle of reminding the administration of those provisions. So therefore, one is access, because partly because of absence of documentation on the part of parents. The other is the question of continuity of the curriculum as well as language of instruction, because say a person from the tribal belt of Jharkhand who comes to Mumbai, or from Bihar, or tribe of the interior of Bihar, ends up needing to learn in a different language from the one that's spoken at home. So therefore, the question of multilingual education and the need for, especially in the early grades, for the child to learn in the mother tongue is something that has been repeatedly recognized, but hasn't necessarily been acted upon adequately. So those are two of probably, and the third is if parents do need to migrate, then there are alternate, and if it is a short term migration of, say, they need to uh, go somewhere for work for, say, a couple of months, there are provisions on the books in the form of short stay homes for the kids. The kids can stay, their parents can move. So therefore, those provisions exist on the books. Unfortunately, a they're not scaled up adequately. As in, we know that it exists, but keeping children safe and well fed and protected doesn't come cheap. So therefore, many state governments do not opt for this. Secondly, data systems are weak in India. It's not an education specific thing. Generally, in India, data systems are weak. So therefore, how many eligible children are there to start a short stay home for At what point do we know we have 50 kids to start a short stay home? Those data systems are weak, and uh, therefore they may not be a supply when there is no visible mechanism to collect demand. uh, Language is complex. Again, some states have done it in the past. Say Gujarat has a mechanism of, they know, if you, it's not rocket science. In a lot of cases, it's the same families that move from point A to point B every year. So therefore, in those instances, it's a function of maintaining a record of this kid has moved with his parents from point X to point Y. Therefore, the education department of the source informs the destination that there is a kid coming in, and the destination knows how many books in that language are needed. So the kid comes with his textbook. Therefore, those provisions can exist and have been attempted and have been proven to work. But again, it's not, it entails setting up mechanisms and keeping them running in the long run rather than just doing pilots, which again may not be politically the easiest thing for an administration to do. And why does all this is symptoms? In that sense, why don't we do this? Is because we don't care. Because these are the poor, the vulnerable, the disadvantaged, the voiceless. Therefore, they're not the one who has the highest uh, demand capacity, generation capacity. So therefore, most of the time, it's easier to ignore them than to fix the problem.
Hmm.
This time we saw the migrants move. So therefore, possibly it's pulling at our heartstrings more. But fundamentally, that's what's been happening. Maybe not at this scale, but every year. And unfortunately, we've been ignoring it.
Um, right, Anjela ji. Thank you for sharing this very important perspective that, like you said, that it's something which has become very visible or kind of covered in the media with respect to the the migration, the distress migration sector. But like you mentioned, it is something which has been a recurring thing over years, and has is something which needs to be fixed more, addressed more urgently, if it hasn't been yet. You did also mention about like the widening gaps between I mean across gender with respect to post pandemic. We are seeing more the risk of especially girls having access to digital learning, and also the risk of them maybe not returning to school has really increased. What would your thoughts be with respect to where we stand on that aspect, and how do we prepare? We are seeing schools reopening in some states. How do we ensure that this risk of so many girls and children dropping out permanently does not happen? What could be some preparations that should be done from now on?
So first of all, we are doing going about our reopening the absolutely wrong way. If you look at the statistics of COVID risk, then younger children are less vulnerable than older ones. So therefore, if one could have planned for the younger grades to return, because the evidence is the most negative learning, psychological trauma related impacts are on the younger child. The older child is by then more mature, better able to understand what's happening, whereas the whole lockdown has been a period of trauma for the younger kids who can't understand why they can't leave the house to play with their friends. or for that matter, why are they trapped inside with possibly abusive parents or siblings or relatives? uh, Congested by abusive, I mean fundamentally the little kid is underfoot in a house where there's a one room apartment with three adults and four adults and a bunch of kids. So therefore it's not been an easy time for them. So therefore to me it's planning for reopening not just for the upper grades but the lower grades, which is when you look at the experience of the countries that have lifted lockdowns before us, they have by and large gone ahead with lifting lockdowns for the younger children before the older ones. So therefore that to me is one clear omission that we are making. And when I'm saying we need to reopen, I don't mean just let's reopen and send everyone to school. You need to plan for it. You need to vaccinate your teachers and other education personnel, which hasn't been a priority. So therefore, plan for reopening, reopen, let the younger kids go because the impact has been the most painful for them. When it comes to therefore, I don't think there's any alternative beyond that, or not least given by now we probably, when I last checked, we had the fourth longest school lockdown in the world. It's time to start accepting that kids deserve to be educated in an educational institution and not left to their devices at home. Yes, in so doing, you do need to plan for a strategy that's more gender responsive. So therefore, be it in terms of greater support to girls, in terms of even when it's blended learning, providing them with the supports that they deserve and they need, be it in terms of, for example, when schools close, access to first, no, it's not just schools don't just provide toilets and other facilities. It's also access to things like sanitary pads for adolescents, etc., which are lost. So making sure that these specific needs of girls are addressed would be critical for any reopening or any return to normalcy.
Right. Um, Anjela ji, thank you for again sharing your thoughts on this. Um, Coming to Right to Education Act again, right? And it is something which sees education as a right, and if I'm not wrong, it's now seen as a fundamental right, which if denied can, like there can be like learners can kind of seek judicial remedy for that. Do you think if when we talk about children not having access to digital learning, is would you say that that is something which can be kind of looked at as denying the right to education? And do you think that there is kind of any kind of discussion on conversation on getting kind of judicial remedy for this?
Yes, there has been discussion on it. There hasn't been a consensus. As you would have probably made out by now, that I'm probably in the school of people who feel that what kids need right now is not necessarily digital education, because it isn't what a kid deserves, but some return to normalcy. It probably isn't either or, but I do think we've failed our children by restricting their access to education to only digital modes. And we do need to accept that 100 years of history of compulsory schooling shows that if you want kids to be educated and not in child labor, then we do need to get them to return to physical schools.
Hmm. Right.
So if I have to prioritize, I would prioritize reopening as my advocacy agenda over a right to facilitating online education. If one had to choose between the two, sure, in an ideal world, one would want to have an element of both, but I would prefer schools to reopen in a way that's safe, equitable, and conducive to uh, the right to education of these children.
Right. Um, uh, Another question that we also had was that I mean, we clearly see that a lot of what is there on policy, with maybe intentions that are good, often don't translate well on the ground with respect to equity in education. Uh, you did mention Kerala, for example, as one state which kind of stands out in terms of its outcomes it has delivered in education or literacy. Uh, would you say that there are any success stories where existing inequalities in society have been, like overcome, um, uh, for kind of delivering equitable education, be it in India, be it outside India? And what did it take? What was that recipe which can really help to overcome these existing societal inequalities, to address, to kind of give equitable and quality education for all children who deserve it?
Unfortunately, there is no royal road to equity. There is only the gradual social struggle for social transformation. So therefore, are there models where societies have transformed with education being one of the core instruments? The answer probably is yes. If you go back to the Ambedkar movement, for example, it's ultimately education that is at the heart of the struggle for empowerment. So therefore, even within India, the Dalit movement is in a lot of ways based around the value of education. Have there been governments who have done their own pieces which have contributed to equity in education? Uh, Even a state like Bihar, a lot of Nitish's reputation was initially built around his bicycle scheme, which, with all its limitations, did ensure continuation of education for a large number of girls. Uh, uh, Therefore, when you pick up specifics, each state has would probably have one or two positive things that they have done, and they've done well. So therefore, when the state decides to address it because the political social equation mandates that they do something in to address the needs of its core constituency, the Indian state is quite capable of responding. So therefore, if the political equation can be made to work to deliver quality, equitable education for all, then sure it would.
Right. Anjela ji, I think you've really triggered a lot of thoughts among all our audience members as well. That when we talk about equity in education, while our policies um, have these visions of equitable access, quality, it is how it translates onto the ground really depends on political will and governance, and of course, like grassroots movements and kind of pressure on making the system accountable as well. So I think these are some very, and you've really raised some very important points, which are, of course, these are difficult facts and truths with respect to inequalities in gender, which, I mean, it has been aggravated because of the pandemic, migrant families, etc., and a lot of distress which is happening. And also your recommendation on how we should reopen school rather than, like, kind of focus more on facilitating digital learning. I think these are some important points which should be discussed more with all the organizations, be it government stakeholders, civil society organizations as well. So we would like to thank you for joining us here, for sharing your thoughts. And again, when we talk about disrupting the foundational literacy and numeracy crisis that we are facing, equity is something which needs to be put right at the center of it, because if a large portion of our children are not getting that quality education, then foundational literacy and numeracy will also not be something which they'll achieve. Thank you, Anjela ji, for joining us, and
My
thank you to all
pleasure.
who, yes, who are joining us live. And we'll see you in the next session of Detox.